Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to cut through the noise and really bring you the most important bits of knowledge. Today, we're diving into something, well, pretty fascinating, almost contradictory, On one side, you hear reports, right? A major world leader apparently pushing hard for a peace deal in a really critical conflict zone. But then at the exact same time, European nations, places like the Netherlands, they're planning these just huge increases in defense spending, massive jumps. It really makes you wonder, are we looking at two totally different versions of reality here? So for this deep dive, our mission is to unpack the complex forces playing out behind these headlines. We've got a really compelling stack of sources today, everything from some sharp Dutch political commentary, insights from a former top U.S. official, and some pretty insightful economic analysts, too. We want to help you understand what's really driving these big decisions and, what it all means for the bigger picture. So, yeah, let's unpack this. Is Europe actually genuinely gearing up for war? Or is there something else, maybe something far more intricate going on behind the scenes?
Exactly. And it's that intricacy we really need to explore. The surface story, well, it often hides a much more complex web of motivations, especially when you start digging into the actual numbers.
Absolutely. So let's start right there then with those numbers, particularly in the Netherlands. Our sources point to this big national debate, right, about boosting the defense budget. Initially, there was talk of a pretty hefty 5% increase, but then suddenly a different number, 3.5%, started popping up in the conversation. What's the story there? Why the drop from 5% down to 3.5%?
Yeah, what's fascinating here and quite revealing, I think, is that the 1.5% difference wasn't just, a simple budget cut. It was actually earmarked for civilian infrastructure. We're talking things like bridges and roads. And the argument they're making is that solid national infrastructure is vital for a functioning defense system, which, okay, maybe. So while it's important, yeah, it's not directly funding weapons or troops. It really does suggest some European countries are getting, well, pretty creative with their counting, wouldn't you say?
Creative accounting, yeah, that's one way to put it. I mean, bridges and roads are obviously essential, but calling it defense spending, it feels like a bit of a stretch, maybe just to hit those targets. Are we seeing similar stuff happening elsewhere in Europe?
Oh, absolutely. The Netherlands isn't alone here at all. We've seen examples like Spain, reportedly including things like sustainability initiatives right inside their defense budget calculations. And, maybe even more significant across the board, financial aid given to Ukraine. That's frequently being added to European defense budgets. Now look, aid to Ukraine is undoubtedly critical, right? But counting it this way, well, it creates the appearance of meeting NATO targets, specifically that 2% GDP goal. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're investing more in their own actual armies or their own operational capabilities. So the really important question for us, I think, is what are these defense budgets truly reflecting when they're shown to the public? And, why this layer of obfuscation?
That's a really critical point. And you might be listening right now thinking, okay, why should I care about these percentages and these accounting tricks? What's the most compelling alternative reason for this creative accounting if it's not just about pure military readiness? What other priorities might these numbers be hiding?
Well, it speaks directly to how public money is actually being allocated, right?
Yeah.
And what underlying priorities these figures really serve. If a country is, say, struggling to hit that NATO target, they might try to include some non-military spending just to show commitment, But it also reveals a real tension, the pressure to meet these international obligations versus, well, internal domestic needs like those bridges and roads we mentioned. It's often about optics, I think. And maybe it's a way to justify pretty significant financial outflows to a public that might be a bit skeptical, trying to frame it all as essential for defense in a really broad sense. This could also let funds flow into other sectors, maybe indirectly, perhaps even feeding specific industries.
Right. And that kind of leads us into where things get really, really interesting and maybe a bit provocative. Our deep dive includes insights from Catherine Austin Fitts. She's a former top official back in the Bush administration. And she offers this really stark and frankly pretty provocative view on the whole Ukraine situation. She sees it less as a traditional war and more as what she actually calls a clearance operation. Can you unpack what she means by clearance?
Right. So Catherine Austin Fitts suggests that the U.S. president, acting, she argues, on behalf of private financial interests, is really focused on mapping and ultimately controlling assets within Ukraine. So from her viewpoint, this clearance isn't about achieving typical warfare objectives. Instead, she argues it involves moving people out, and we know Ukraine's population has dropped significantly, which allows private interests to effectively take control of the land. And then taxpayer money gets channeled into reconstruction efforts, which essentially turns into a very high-return real estate development project for those private entities involved.
Wow. Okay, so just to sum that up, Catherine is basically suggesting that this conflict, underneath all the headlines, is fundamentally about a strategic asset grab, one that's funded indirectly by taxpayers and leads to, well, private wealth consolidation. That's a really striking reinterpretation. But how does this idea connect to her wider view of the U.S. administration's overall strategy?
Well, if we zoom out a bit, Catherine argues that the current U.S. administration seems determined to sort of re-engineer the entire dollar system, really, to maintain its global dominance.
Yeah.
She talks about how this involves putting just immense pressure on European leaders to, and this is her phrase, back to the empire. Yeah, she even points to examples like the assassination of an Iranian nuclear scientist and a leader, suggesting these acts are signals of the U.S.'s willingness to act decisively, ruthlessly even, to maintain its position, and often using what she calls invisible weaponry in these vast surveillance systems. Invisible weaponry and surveillance. That's a very strong claim. Does Catherine give specific examples of what she means by that? Or is it more of a theoretical framework she's using? What's the core takeaway for us here about how global power is actually used, according to her?
She suggests this invisible weaponry isn't really about tanks and jets, you know? It's more about sophisticated financial controls, cyber warfare capabilities, massive surveillance systems, things that can disrupt entire economies, target specific individuals, and exert huge pressure without any overt military action. So the core insight, I think, is that the fight for global dominance isn't always fought on traditional battlefields anymore. It's increasingly fought through economic leverage, controlling information, and these sort of unseen technological capabilities. It's about maintaining financial and informational power as the main way to project influence globally. Right. And speaking of these huge financial strategies and the systems that make them possible, Catherine also brings up a really concerning lack of transparency. She points out that since the first Trump administration, the U.S. apparently adopted policies that allow it to keep secret books. What does that mean for understanding where all this money, especially defense money, is actually ending up?
Yeah, this is absolutely crucial when we talk about accountability, isn't it? Secret books basically means that significant chunks of defense spending aren't fully transparent. They're off the public record. This makes it extremely difficult, maybe impossible, to understand where defense money is really going, who's getting it. And, are these budgets genuinely for producing weapons for national defense? Or are they feeding black budgets, maybe contributing to this consolidation of capital into private hands? It immediately raises the question, how much real transparency actually exists in these massive financial flows? And what happens when public funds become so opaque?
It paints a pretty stark picture, yeah. The whole idea of the monetary system, the military complex, and big finance acting like a parasite on the global economy. That's how one source put it. It's an incredibly powerful image. On a personal level, what's one implication of this parasitic model that you think listeners should maybe be most aware of in their own lives?
I think the most direct implication for you, listening right now, is that a significant chunk of your tax money, which you might think is going towards public good or national defense, could actually be flowing into systems that ultimately concentrate wealth and power in private hands, rather than directly serving the stated public purpose, you see. It affects the economy, it affects the availability of public services, and ultimately, the distribution of wealth in our society. It really encourages us all to look beyond just the headlines and ask who truly benefits from these absolute colossal expenditures.
Okay, let's pivot now to Ralph Dekker. He offers a slightly more maybe optimistic or perhaps just pragmatic view on some of this, particularly regarding Trump's approach and Europe's capacity. He seems to acknowledge Trump's reasoning, but kind of questions if it's realistic.
Right. Ralph understands Trump's big push for massive investment in American military hardware. He sees it as a pretty clever way, actually, to secure U.S. income streams. From Trump's angle, this strategy could pave the way for a potential U.S. withdrawal from Europe, which would save the U.S. significant costs down the line. So it's a clear economic rationale, right? Make Europe buy American weapons, and then America can afford to step back a bit.
Okay, that sounds like a classic Trump economic play, sure. But Ralph argues this is mostly just a theoretical exercise. Why does he think Europe can't realistically take on this massive military burden themselves?
Well, he points out that countries like the UK, France, Germany, they simply can't afford the kind of military buildup being proposed. Their national budgets are already seriously strained. So Ralph's argument is, if the U.S. did withdraw, as Trump sometimes suggests, Europe would basically be forced to find some kind of accommodation with Russia through diplomacy, through cooperation, rather than trying to mount this incredibly serious and frankly unaffordable military opposition. He suggests the resources, the money, just isn't there for Europe to become a truly independent military superpower on that scale on its own.
That's a really interesting counterpoint to the narrative you sometimes hear of this inevitable European arms race. It makes me wonder, though, are we maybe being overly flooded with, say, Western propaganda that constantly downplays the possibility of diplomacy or trade partnerships, making it seem like a huge arms buildup is the only option? What are the real obstacles stopping leaders from pursuing that diplomatic route right now, beyond just the propaganda idea Ralph mentions?
That's a crucial question, isn't it? I mean, look, defending borders is obviously a baseline requirement for any nation. That's a given. But the sheer volume of weapons being proposed right now seems, well, disproportionate. Especially if, as Ralph suggests, Russia doesn't actually harbor ambitions to occupy vast parts of Europe. The barriers to diplomacy, though, they're often deeply entrenched geopolitical alliances. Powerful economic interests tied directly to the military-industrial complex. And there's also the perceived political risk, right, of appearing soft on an adversary, especially to a domestic audience. Plus, the current political climate can just make diplomatic engagement extremely difficult to sell to a public that's maybe been conditioned to see military strength as the only real solution. As one of our sources note, though, trade itself is often a much stronger form of diplomacy than armed confrontation.
So, what does this all boil down to then? We see this real tension, right, between an economic model that seems to almost thrive on military spending and the potential for a more diplomatic, maybe multipolar world. One source even highlighted how things like trade wars and these constantly shifting tariffs actually block regular commerce. And that blockage could maybe inadvertently drive the need for military financial flows. Almost like if regular trade is choked off, military spending rushes in to fill that economic void.
It's a really concerning correlation, isn't it? The idea that disrupting normal, peaceful economic exchange could potentially fuel the need for military-industrial activity. If countries aren't trading goods effectively, maybe they end up trading arms instead, or relying more heavily on defense spending just to stimulate their own economies. It sort of implies a system where conflict, or even just the threat of conflict, can become this kind of perverse economic driver, especially when traditional trade routes are blocked or stifled.
Okay, let's briefly touch on something else mentioned in the sources. Trump's nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize, Catherine Austin Fitts. She views it mostly as a kind of tribute, maybe a public relations tool, given Trump's known sensitivity to his image and his brand.
Indeed. And then we also hear from a student of history, identified as Thomas. He suggests this nomination could actually create a significant personal dilemma for Trump. The choice between pursuing the prestige of a peace prize versus embracing the massive industrial money flow that's directed towards America when military spending ramps up. However, Thomas also makes a really important point. A lot of the actual decision-making around war and military spending doesn't rest solely with the president. It's often heavily influenced by Congress or even by what some people call the deep state. Powerful, often unelected figures or groups within government agencies like the Pentagon, perhaps, who wield significant influence behind the scenes. So while a Nobel Prize might certainly appeal to a leader's ego, the underlying machinery of military finance can be much, much larger and more powerful than any single individual, even the president.
That's a crucial distinction, yeah. Highlighting the limits of power, even for someone in the Oval Office. And if we broaden this out again, Thomas, being a student of German history, reminds us about Germany's historical pride in its industry and its really critical role in the Energiewende. That's their huge, ambitious energy transition plan. Germany's past reliance on cheap Russian fuel, which they now apparently get through backdoors via other countries, but at double the price, and then their potential pivotal role in European rearmament. It just highlights the incredibly complex geopolitical currents swirling around. How does Germany's unique situation complicate this whole picture for Europe?
Germany is truly, truly at a crossroads right now. Its economic powerhouse status was built, in large part, on access to cheap Russian energy. That fueled its industrial might for decades. Now, that lifeline is effectively cut. They're forced to pay double, sometimes more, for energy that's essentially laundered through other nations before it gets to them. And at the same time, they're facing intense pressure to rearm, which really runs counter to their post-World War II identity, their focus on economic strength, and what you might call soft power. So their dilemma isn't just about defense budgets. It's about redefining their entire national identity, their economic model, their very place in a rapidly shifting European and global order. The choices Germany makes now will inevitably ripple right across the continent. They'll likely determine whether Europe leans further towards militarization or is perhaps ultimately forced back to the negotiating table, maybe out of sheer economic necessity.
So we started off asking, is Europe genuinely gearing up for war, or is something else entirely going on? Our journey through these sources today reveals that the answer is, well, far more complex than a simple yes or no. It touches on everything from, creative accounting and budgets to grand schemes of economic re-engineering.
Yeah, this deep dive really shows a constant struggle, doesn't it, between forces trying to centralize capital and control globally, and maybe the desire, voiced by some, to reverse what they describe as a kind of parasitic financial military complex. We've heard that call, for us to stop this centralization. So as you, listening, reflect on all of this, what really stands out to you? How much real control do individual nations or even leaders actually have when they're caught in the middle of these immense global forces and high-stakes negotiations? And maybe the biggest question, what is the most effective path forward? Is it through a continued arms race? Or is it through renewed diplomacy and trade? It's a question that really demands our attention, I think, because the implications touch every part of our lives from public spending right through to global stability.